Thanks for listening to this podcast of Trending with Timmerie. If you haven't already subscribed, please catch us wherever you love to listen to your podcast, from the Relevant Radio app to Apple, YouTube, you name it, we are there. And if you listen on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to go and give us a 5-star review to help other people discover the podcast. Anything you share in terms of episodes, whether it's texting it to a friend, posting on social media, helps to build up the kingdom for God, to help confront the challenging issues we face as a culture, but with joy, with hope, and with an eternal perspective where our faith collides with everyday life, bringing eternal principles to help us live our life joyfully.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio.
Welcome to our weekly Gentleman's Hour today on Trending. One of the girls I grew up dancing with, I just learned her father died this week after summiting one of the tallest mountains in the world. Over 22,000 feet high, almost 23,000. Phenomenal. He took a picture at the top of the mountain and then not long later suffered medical complications. Details yet have not been released, but he actually died from the summit. And it brought to mind this question having to do with proportionate risk, disproportionate risk, and just that male desire for adventure and risk and how important that is for men, but also what can go too far, what might be seemingly selfish. Is it selfish? I think it's a question to ask. And I've had a lot of fascinating conversations about this recently. So we're going to unpack that today on Trending with Catholic writer Casey Chalk, who's also served, actually the majority of his 20s, serving multiple tours in Afghanistan. We're going to dive into the topic of cultivating risk and adventure in our lives along with virtue and phasing into Lent. We're just a week away of the kickoff of Lent with Ash Wednesday. I really hope you're making your Mardi Gras Fat Tuesday plans. I know I am. I started baking cookies today, and I thought, just for the fun of it with my daughter, and I thought, we'll just stash them all away in the freezer for feast days as well as for Fat Tuesday and take a little bit of them out. I'm going to start doing that, especially because it's a fun activity with her, and I don't really make time to bake otherwise, and yet she really enjoys it, so it's a good thing to do together. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. I'll also share with you a little bit about what's happening on the pro-life front with the massive expansion of RU 486 chemical abortion into pharmacies. We're talking about Walgreens, Rite Aid, among others, and how young people are talking about the importance of not just allowing others to hear pro-abortion TikTok arguments, that we need to hear pro-life arguments engaged one-on-one rather than being influenced by social media and just retorting with pro-abortion responses. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. It's our weekly Gentleman's Hour. Casey Chalk, welcome back to Trending here today.
Hey, Timmerie. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So getting to know a little bit about you and your background, because you're new to Trending here. I know you spent the majority of your 20s serving multiple tours in Afghanistan. Can you tell me a little bit about, just a little bit about that? And I want to dive into today's topic.
Yeah, sure. The first time that I went to Afghanistan was in 2009. And it was both one of the worst and one of the best experiences of my life. Worst because serving in a war zone was terrifying and full of all kinds of perils and whatnot, but also really thrilling. And I felt like I really grew as a man while serving there. And I loved it so much. I definitely volunteered for future opportunities to go, and I ended up going back to Afghanistan a bunch of times. For the remainder of my 20s. Yeah. And like you said, I spent quite a bit of my latter 20s serving both in Kabul and in Kandahar, Afghanistan.
Thank you for your service and for the great sacrifice you've made for this nation. I know you and I were talking about that in light of a recent story having to do with risk and adventure. So there's so much to unpack here. I gave you a call yesterday because I heard the news that one of the girls I grew up dancing with, that her dad just died. Now, he has 2 adult children, and he died after having summited one of the tallest mountains in the world at 22,837 feet. He summited Mount Aconcagua in Argentina. Now, my initial reaction to this was, wow, What a way to die. I mean, he literally summited this massive mountain. I grew up in the mountains about 6,500 feet up, and elevation was never really a thing that I fully understood as an issue. But after not living in the mountains, I understand a little better than before. And the risk and danger involved when summiting such a high mountain at such a high altitude. Now, he was photographed having actually made it to the top of the mountain, over 22,000 feet high. But then on his way down, it seems like, or not long after having summited, details haven't come out yet, he suffered medical complications and actually died. And my thoughts as I was kind of thinking about this, I started hearing reactions from other people talking about how it was selfish. And having talked to a number of people, Casey, I've been fascinated to kind of look at this from a couple perspectives. One, asking whether or not it is selfish. And gentlemen, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Number's 1-888-914-9149, or you can go and comment now on social media. We're taking those comments on the social media posts we put up. But the other perspective also is the need for adventure and risk in a man's life. I'd like to hear your thoughts, Casey.
I mean, I don't know if I would feel competent to judge the individual circumstances of your friend's father. It's certainly a terrible and sad story. I think I would say more generally that
exactly. Kind of diving into the general issue of it.
Yeah. So, as a father, as someone who became a father while I was still going to Afghanistan pretty regularly, I know that my wife, certainly after our first child and then progressively after our second and third, was very insistent that I bring to a close that chapter of my life and stop going to the war zone, where, my life was much more in danger than it is in Virginia where we live. And I recognized and appreciated that concern, that my responsibilities were more directly to my wife and to my kids, and that I had a responsibility, certainly, to serve my country. That was great, and I'm very honored and excited and happy that I got to do that. But alternatively, recognizing that my primary responsibility was had become as a husband and a father, and I needed to be responsive to my wife's needs and to the needs of my kids, and to not take risks unnecessarily that would put my ability to provide for them in jeopardy.
So what did you do? You transitioned out. Was it an immediate transition? What did that transition look like? Because I know for some people who are maybe in a similar circumstance, they don't know what that transition would even look like for them.
Yeah, I did have to go a couple more times after my wife had kind of asked that I, stop going to the war zones. So we had a transition period that went on for about a year where I went back. I tried to go for shorter periods of time, which I was able to work out, and that was good, so that I wasn't in danger for as long. But yeah, eventually I more or less had to change the kind of work that I did in order to make that happen. And in one sense, it's sad. There was a great thrill. I think I confessed to you yesterday, I was kind of addicted to going to the war zones in a way. There was kind of just like this exhilarating thrill from being put in danger. But alternatively, I recognized that, I needed to make this broader sacrifice for the well-being of my family. And I'm very grateful that I did now, because I like, it's a very sad thing. I can think of the people that I knew that I served with who died in Afghanistan, and I'm grateful to God that Lord willing, I'll be able to provide for my wife and kids for many years to come.
I want to talk a little bit about kind of a maturity that I noticed you even shared, and kind of that desire for risk and that need for adventure. You shared when we were talking yesterday about how you almost in some ways felt more alive when you were in Afghanistan than you were home. And the fact that you recognize that, it kind of addresses the issue in and of itself. But I also think it touches deeply on a challenge for many men of that deep-seated need to take a risk, to do something dangerous, to have an adventure, and how often for men, when they don't have that, it can pose a real challenge for them, both personally as well as in their marriage relationships and with their children.
Oh, I wholeheartedly agree with that. I do think that I think we live in a great crisis in regards to men and masculinity in our culture, and there's a lot of temptations, not just like, I don't just mean like sexual temptations, although that's very legitimate, but temptations to kind of go down really weird routes that a lot of celebrities are encouraging as ways to exemplify masculinity from these people, gym rats who, invest massive amounts of time in trying to sculpt the perfect body, or going on the kinds of adventures like your friend's father. Like every year, I've got to take some big trip and go on some great risky adventure and push the limits. I don't know. I suppose that can be well and good in certain respects, but alternatively, I think that I think we have many opportunities to exemplify courage and take risks even in our normal lives. I mean, good grief. In my family, we're on one income, trying to raise 5 kids and not send them into the public school system in Virginia. That's there's a lot of risk involved in that. And so, but I get it too, that there's a physical component as well. I mean, look, I grew up playing competitive tennis. I love competitive sports and playing them. And that's another sacrifice that I've had to make as we've had more kids, that I haven't had the opportunity to do that. I love it. I think that men need to look for those kinds of opportunities as well. It's good. It's good to compete, whether physically or intellectually, cerebrally. You can do that by playing sports. You can do that by playing chess. But yeah, I get it that it's deeply ingrained. It's built into the masculine ethos. And I think it's just more like a means of finding what kinds of ways we can do that that don't involve going and hiking the biggest mountain in the world.
Right. And I think that when you were talking, even giving the example of taking the risk with regard to living on one income in Virginia, trying not to send your kids to the public school system, I think there's a difference. And again, this is something that requires maturity. And I use the word maturity because I think it's very easy for all of us to kind of get stuck in this rut of not progressing in our lives, emotionally, intellectually. And it's not just children that can be stymied in their development. It's adults too, and certain areas of our lives. And for men to kind of make that transition, to see the difference between unnecessary risk to kind of get that fun high versus sacrificial challenge, or even fun risks and challenges that aren't quite so dangerous. You give the example of the challenge to provide for your family the way you do. That's a risk and a challenge in and of itself. And I think changing that language and mindset a little bit is a shift that is helpful, especially for those who really do desire great challenges, Casey. I even think of, a couple friends in my life, one whose husband served for many years with SWAT, and then worked in the Coast Guard and served overseas and works in law enforcement now, and really prefers to be in the thick of things in law enforcement, on the ground, boots on the ground, rather than progressing up the ranks in more of a managerial desk job. And I see that desire and I see that need. And for some, I think it's greater than others. But adapting that sacrificial challenge and risk is a real maturity that I think is very, very manly in and of itself.
Oh, I wholeheartedly agree. I think also there's the risk of simply living an authentic Christian faith in a culture which is so deeply secular and antagonistic towards the Christian faith. I think about all of the times where my wife and I have to think through how we're going to have hard conversations with, whether it's, people that I have at work, or neighbors where, their kids are being exposed to transgenderism, for example. I mean, we have a neighbor who their daughter identifies as both a girl and a boy, and figuring out what does it look like to love them, but also to speak truth into their lives. I mean, you want to talk about risk, that there's a tremendous amount of risk that goes with trying to proactively and outspokenly live our Christian faith in the 21st century.
And I appreciate that you mentioned the issue of transgenderism, because that is a risk today in a certain respect, whether it be a risk of hurting the person you're talking to, the risk of alienating yourself. There are so many things that can go on even with that transgender crisis occurring. I think about yesterday sharing the testimony of a swimmer who tied with so-called Leah Thomas, who's a biological male, competed for 3 years at the University of Pennsylvania, and suddenly decided to compete as a woman and identify as a woman. And after not placing at all against men, he now places and ties with and beats out Olympians and national record holders in swimming. It's fascinating to see that many people are afraid to say, no, it's not okay. It's not okay for this man to be in the women's locker room. But saying no in today's culture really is one of the riskiest, and I would argue even at times adventurous things to do, is to stand for your Christian values. So I really appreciate you mentioning that. Have you ever read the book Wild at Heart?
Yeah, by John Eldridge. I'm a
Yes.
former evangelical, and that book was very popular with evangelical guys when I was in college. So I've skimmed through it. I haven't read the whole thing, but I'm familiar with the general thesis of Eldridge's book.
Right. And I know now he has a podcast as well, and we'll have to have him on the show here one of these days. But one of the things that I think is important in a lot of his work that he talks about is that not just men, but men and women need adventure in their lives. And if we stop taking adventures, even for example, in our marriages, if we stop taking adventures together, that it's unhealthy for the relationship. We need that to kind of fight against the restlessness that can naturally occur within our human nature. And I appreciate kind of that need to understand the importance of adventure and understanding not that like men are wild beasts to be tamed, but that men need adventure. They need things that challenge them, that kind of step into a primitive world that sometimes I think we've stepped too far away from.
Yeah, well, that for me, that brings to mind thinking about the fact that so much of our lives are sedentary now. A lot of young men, I mean, frankly, even guys who are my age or older, are addicted to video games and computer games. And I mean, they go there because there is a sense of risk and adventure there, but really it's fabricated because they're just going into this fake world that really has no connection with reality. I'm not saying that, guys need to necessarily give up all video games or computer games, but I do think it's a great temptation and sort of a distraction from the real risks of the world where, I mean, men, women, children out there, whether we're talking about Christians or non-Christians who need to hear the gospel, those are people who are in desperate need of men willing to exemplify courage out in the world rather than, with their console alone in a room in their house playing video games for hours on end.
I want to bring the conversation for a minute back to summiting a mountain, kind of what initially triggered this. If you're just listening now with us, joining us, that's Casey Chalk. He's an author, writer. You can find his work online. You can also find him at CaseyChalk.com. That's CaseyChalk.com. We'll post a link on social media to his work. But I shared earlier that an acquaintance of mine that I grew up dancing with, her dad died this last week after summiting one of the tallest mountains in the world in Argentina, Mount Aconcagua, 22,000 feet, almost 23,000 feet high. He was photographed at the top, and then suffered medical complications not long after that. And it's kind of brought to mind that question of the need for risk in men's lives and the need for adventure. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. What's too far? What's proportionate versus disproportionate risk? We're going to unpack that more. But joining me now, Tom from Chino Hills, California, is on the line. Tom, share your thoughts on this.
Hi, Timmery. Yeah, I would just like to recount a experience I had with my son and some of my nieces and nephews. We hiked up Mount Whitney, which is the highest peak in the continental United States. It's about 14,500 feet, and Denali is higher. But it's the type of mountain that's not terribly dangerous. It takes a couple days to hike up, but there are some somewhat treacherous areas where you're hiking across snowy ledges. And
Right.
When we hit one of these with my son, who was in high school at the time, he became gripped. And we were at about 11,000 feet, and he almost wanted to turn around and go back. And I said, "You can do it. Just follow me." We even had a rope that we attached, and he got across it, and he was just elated. Just this milestone of building confidence. He got to the top of the mountain, and we took some pictures. And I have this one picture of him with his arms outspread, almost in a joyful, just lifting up his arms in prayer, just to be at the top of the mountain with people he loved. On the way back down, he went across that ledge with no problem, and it was just one of those moments where you just feel so proud that your son has done something where he overcame his fear. So I just really encourage fathers to maybe give their kids some things that maybe require some risk, where they have to face their fear. And certainly, if he had slipped, he could have slid down that mountain, and who knows what could have happened. But with caution, he was able to do it. We all did it, and we're the better for it. So, yeah, some risk-taking is, I think, vital. And so often parents nowadays, they want to protect their kids from any discomfort or anything that might create
Right.
some fear or maybe even a little bit of risk. I don't believe in unnecessary risks. I did some rock climbing, but when I married, I just said I'm done with rock climbing because there's just too many risks involved with it. So I think each person has to kind of decide for themselves. But if you're a father, provide some risk for your kids. It's the rewards are tremendous.
Tom, I really appreciate you sharing that experience because, again, there's proportionate risk, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But risk taking in parenthood, I'm so glad you mentioned that because there is sort of this bubble wrapping of children today. You know, I grew up in the mountains in Southern California, so I'm very, very aware of Mount Whitney and the mountain ranges that we have, gloriously looking up at the peaks, especially there from Chino, where you live. And I remember growing up, we would take off for hours hiking, me and some of my friends, some neighbors, and we would rock climb. I mean, things we didn't even think of as being risky and things we never should have done. I remember one day taking my mom on some of kind of the rock climbing areas that we went through, and I never even thought about it as rock climbing. I just thought, okay, we scale down these rocks and we get down to the creek where we want to swim. And it wasn't until years later when I took my mom, she went, "Oh my goodness gracious, you were doing this every day and you had your little sister on your back or one of your friends' backs." And she was horrified when she realized. But at the same time, I think there's this realization of a balance proportionate within fear and allowing for the strings to be loosened, but then also acknowledging the balance in all of that at the same time. And as a father, as a parent, you have to weigh those risks. And like you said, your son certainly could have slipped and fallen a ways down that mountain, which could have been extremely dangerous. But you also knew that he was capable of doing it. Casey's joining me now. Casey, I'd like to hear your thoughts because you recently had an experience with hiking as well that was a little more on the dangerous side that pushed that kind of parent boundary of proportionate adventure and risk in your and your family's life.
Yeah, I recently wrote about this at Crisis Magazine. So this happened over the Christmas holiday. We were visiting my wife's family down in Georgia near Atlanta. And for those from the South, may be familiar with Stone Mountain, which is not a particularly treacherous hike unless it's rained a lot, which in this case it had. And me kind of being stupid and not really thinking that through, and it had been a number of years since I'd gone up Stone Mountain. I went up with my four oldest children. My youngest was 2 years old, and we got to a point where it became very slick. But I thought we were just so close to the top, and I really wanted them to be able to see the view from the top because it really is incredible and worth it. But I was basically I pushed them too hard. We were beyond what my kids were capable of. There was a lot of crying from the girls, and there may have been crying from boys too. But I wouldn't want to throw them under the bus. But
They were young.
Yeah, exactly. It did reach a point where I had to recognize that I had already been imprudent, and that to go on further would really endanger them, and especially because my youngest, my 2-year-old, I more or less had to carry him for a lot of the top of that hike, and getting back down took a long time. I really had to rely on my 9-year-old daughter, who like you, is a dancer, and so she's very sure-footed, thank God. And she was able to kind of help me with getting the younger kids who felt a lot less confident to get down that mountain. But afterwards, going to the caller's point, I think it's really important to find that a healthy balance. We're called to demonstrate courage, one of the cardinal virtues. We're also called to demonstrate prudence, another one of the cardinal virtues. And I think that finding the right level of risk, of course, like you said, I think it's always going to be a judgment call in particular circumstances, but I think it's the intersection of those two virtues and recognizing, what prudence has to say about the level of risk that we're willing to take, and not, making ridiculously, foolish decisions that are going to endanger us or endanger others. And to his point as well about, coddling kids, there's actually a very good book on this that came out a few years ago by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, I think are their names, The Coddling of the American Mind, which I definitely encourage listeners to check out. Which one of the main, these guys are, one's a psychologist, I want to say the other one maybe is in law, and they talk about the detrimental impact that helicopter parenting is having on children, not just as they're young and trying to push boundaries and explore and learn about themselves in the natural world, but the effect that it's having on them as they go to college and then enter the workforce, that their inability to take risk and their need to be protected and have safe spaces, the detrimental impact it's having on their own emotional maturity and psychological development.
We'll post a link to that book as well as Wild at Heart and the Coddling of the American Mind. Casey, let's come back in just a moment because I would like to talk a little bit more about developing virtue in the midst of taking risk and adventure, how we can cultivate risk and adventure in your lives. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. It's our weekly Gentleman's Hour. If you have a thought, would like to weigh in on the conversation, especially with regard to risk taking and summiting that mountain. Numbers 1-888-914-9149.
You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, where you can discuss what matters most to you. Join the conversation, 888-914-9149.
You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. It's our weekly Gentleman's Hour, and we've been talking about taking risk and proportionate risk. So we'll talk about virtue and how to cultivate risk-taking and adventure in your life so that you don't grow restless. And I get it. I grew up in the mountains. I grew up hiking all of the time. I talked about some of the risks that we used to take that is somewhat horrifying, especially now as a parent, to think about, but also the importance of not overly coddling a child and taking that risk analysis of what is a good, healthy risk and challenge for your children. What sparked this conversation is that over the weekend, I learned about the death of an acquaintance of mine who I grew up dancing with. He has 2 adult children now, but he actually died this past week after summiting Mount Aconcagua in Argentina. It's one of the tallest mountains in the world, almost 23,000 feet high. He summited it, took some pictures, and suffered medical complications not long after. Casey, let's talk about this. You're a Catholic writer. You spent the majority of your 20s serving multiple tours in Afghanistan. You shared about how, when you got married and started having children, your wife asked you to, pull back from serving overseas, and you had to make a career transition. So you get this. And especially coming from the perspective of theology and being a parent, a father, while still having that desire for adventure and risk, where do we find the balance in risk taking? And let's talk a little bit about some of those adventures that would be healthy adventures to take.
Well, I think some of the healthy adventures are things that, we can do even within our own neighborhoods and communities, like the book that I mentioned before the break, The Coddling the American Mind. One of the things the authors talk about, and I find it kind of amusing because I think perhaps our parents or grandparents understood these things just very naturally. But the idea that you would just let your kids go off and wander in the woods. Now, granted, I'm not saying necessarily, if you live like in downtown New York City, you just go out, let your kids go wander off, throughout the city or something like that. But for those who live in suburbia or more rural places, and especially if, as long as the area in which you live pretty well. And I think parents need to think about that too, in terms of where they want to buy houses for, for their families, where their kids can have some safety to be able to go out and explore. I can tell you that my kids love going out into the woods. They yearn for the days where when it's not raining and they can go out and build forts and find streams and try to catch things in the water and whatnot. So certainly we need to encourage those things for our own children. Talking about it for adults that's a little bit different.
Right. It's funny though, just to kind of interrupt briefly, well, you mentioned wandering in the woods and allowing kids to do this. What's really funny is when I'm having this conversation with some women about, men and needing to take risk and, what's selfish, what isn't, it was fascinating to me some of the things that women thought selfish or like reckless for men to do. And one thing mentioned was a wife whose husband, used to like to go and like kind of wander off in the woods by himself. And to me, I'm thinking that sounds great. I grew up in the mountains, bears, mountain lions. Yes, there's risk, but you have a certain amount of training to know what to do with regard to certain situations as well. And it was just very fascinating for me to see how different people have different perspectives, I think, based on upbringing and what seems disproportionately risky. I don't think wandering in the woods is risky, but that's something that, maybe you grew up doing versus someone else that didn't. But let's talk a little bit about finding that proportionate balance. And you were mentioning finding the balance between the virtue of courage and prudence in the midst of this as well.
Yeah, so I think that the reason why the cardinal virtues play such a big role in the Christian life and in Catholic theology is because God created a world in which he wanted us to encounter risk, because it's actually the means by which we mature and grow. It's the way that we become more of ourselves and certainly more holy. So we need to be looking for opportunities. I mean, frankly, I think the older I get, the opportunities just come. As long as you're, trying to live an authentic Catholic lifestyle, you don't have to look hard for opportunities to exemplify courage and prudence. I mean, I mentioned before, work. A lot of people probably are in work environments where they deal with difficult people. Perhaps they're very stressful. Perhaps there are a lot of people in the workplace that are not of the same faith or hold the same values. So having to navigate difficult conversations, difficult interactions, difficult choices, all of those are fantastic opportunities to take risks and exemplify courage by, being faithful, which is it's a very hard thing to do in the America in which we live. Many professions are encountering more challenges just to try and do their work and be faithful to Christ and to the church.
The question arises, and I'm seeing it come up on social media as we're talking about taking risk. One of the common things that a lot of people like to do now, especially here in Southern California, is to go off-roading, which I have never been able to understand. I've only ever been off-roading twice, and I was with people who chose to have children in the car. I'm not saying I condone that or not, but the whole off-roading thing, I just don't get. Like, why would you risk your car, and why would you risk tipping over? I think my heart was strained the entire time. But for some, that's the type of risk they take, and a lot of people take today, which is interesting to me.
Yeah, I wonder if some of that has to do with the fact that we are so insulated from risk in a lot of other places in our lives. I think perhaps the pandemic kind of demonstrates that in a certain regard, in the fact that we were so focused on protecting our health. I think that's representative of a larger insulation from threats in our lives. The fact that even something as simple as air conditioning. I mean, the thought of living without air conditioning is something that most Americans, having served in places like Africa, I know what it's like to go without air conditioning for a long period of time. It is very unpleasant. But we are very sheltered now. And I think perhaps the desire to go off-roading or I don't know, paragliding, or any of these other kinds of, intense things, I think they represent the real human desire to be placed in those kinds of circumstances, and the need for it, in the fact that, if your daily humdrum existence is just constant comfort, then you're going to look for more extreme ways to get that thrill.
It was funny. Someone recently mentioned to me how skydiving they thought was such a disproportionate risk, but the studies actually show that very, very few people actually die skydiving, and not that it doesn't happen, but it's interesting again to see what we think is risky and what isn't, and kind of weighing those costs in the midst of it.
Oh yeah, no, that's true. I mean, I guess in some respects, we take a lot of risks when we get in the car and we start driving really aggressively on the road.
I agree.
In comparison to getting on an airplane or anything like that.
Yeah. I mean, just getting in the car, we forget we literally have a lethal weapon in our hands. I remember when I was learning how to drive, my mom would say that over and over again. This is a lethal weapon that you have in your hands. Don't use it in a way that can endanger your life or the lives of others. And yet, isn't that how so many people, driving on the road? I had a teenager just come flying at me. He had a yield sign last week, and I was on a main street. It was like a 6-lane road, and I was just driving 45 in a 50, and he comes flying at me, and I'm swerving, kind of honk at him, and he starts laying on his horn looking at me, and I'm looking back going, there's no merge lane, and there's a yield sign for you. You're practically merging onto a freeway. This is how quickly people are driving here. I'm driving slowly, and I was shocked that he, for 5 minutes behind me on this road, was shaking his head and waving his arm. But it just showed to me how important it was to so many of our young boys today to be able to just drive really fast and just go for it and want to feel alive in the midst of that. As my producer Jim just mentioned, I think that comment is really key, to want to feel alive in the midst of what you're doing.
Yeah, Timmy, I'm sorry. I think that might have been me, so I do apologize for for that behavior on the road the other day. But yeah, and I guess, to the broader theme of this show, I think it's all about then trying to find ways where we can identify some risk that's actually, that's going to be life affirming and make us feel, like I said, like that we have a vibrant existence, and we're looking forward and excited about, the next day. And like I said, as someone I'm very athletic and love playing sports, and having gone, started overseas and whatnot, I get that, and I yearn for those experiences too. Look, I hope that as my kids get older, that we'll be able to take trips internationally. There's lots of places that I've gone, some of them a little bit more dangerous than others, that I'd love to be able to share with my kids. But of course, you have to think carefully about the level of risk. Like I hope that I got to go to Peru a couple years ago and hike Machu Picchu, and I loved Lima. For those who are familiar with some of the saints of South America, some of the greatest saints of the Americas are from Lima, Saint Rosa Lima and Saint Martin de Porres. So I want to, expose my kids to some of those stories and get to see that part of the world. But, right now Peru is going through a major constitutional crisis. So am I going to take my family right there, to Lima and put them at that increased risk? No, I think I'm going to go ahead and wait, until things are a little bit more stable. So again, it just goes to show that we have to moderate that desire for risk with prudential judgment.
Prudential judgment while still building up courage, building up endurance, building all of these things that are so important. And, I think that I got that growing up in the mountains, going hiking, that challenge and that difficulty. And you even mentioned that you took your 2-year-old on that hiking excursion that you had. And it sounds like your 2-year-old hiked part of the time. Is that correct?
Yeah, he was on the ground most of the time, but yeah, once when it was flat, but once it was once it was steep, then I had to carry him. But yeah, and I wanted all my kids to be able to experience that, because this is something very natural in children that they want to experience, and I think it's terribly sad when parents more or less just shield them from all of these things, whether it's by technology or just overwhelming their lives with lots of very organized activities. Obviously kids need some of that too, but they also need the freedom to just kind of go ahead out and explore and test limits. And the only way they're going to be able to do that really is kind of like on their own, when they can go and explore, whether that's the woods or hiking or in the water or whatever.
You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. That's Casey Chalk. Casey, thank you so much for joining us today. You can find his writing online. CaseyChalk.com is the best way to get in contact with him. He writes for Crisis Magazine and many other publications. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. Again, catch him online as well. We'll post a link on social media. Just follow me at Timmerie, Timmerie.
You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, where you can discuss what matters most to you. Join the conversation, 888-914-9149.
Lent is just around the corner. We're a week away. Can you believe it? You can elevate your Lent this year in just 2 minutes each day with Father Rocky's Lenten lessons on the Mass, packed with interesting facts to help you learn more about Mass and your faith. See why these bite-sized videos had over 1 million views last year. Sign up for Father Rocky's Lenten lessons on the Mass today at relevantradio.com/Lent, and they are free. Okay, well, we're talking about Lent. We are a week away from kicking off the Lent season with Ash Wednesday. So mark your calendars, figure out what your Mass time options are, and go to one of the busiest Masses of the year. I know it can be a little overwhelming. But hey, if you go to a super, super early Mass, like those 6:30 a.m. Masses, it might not be as packed. But before we talk about Lent here, I do have to say, we're coming up on Fat Tuesday as well, that has somehow basically become a national holiday, even for non-Catholics, as also known as a Mardi Gras. So plan your Mardi Gras adventure, because this is a great year to really dive in this Lent. And sometimes a feast before the famine can be a really good way to keep things in perspective, to transition us into and out of a liturgical season. I was just sharing, I'm working on kind of doing more cooking activities with my 2-year-old, and baking is one of those things we're starting to do more often. And so I decided to start baking different types of cookies each day this week to save some and freeze them, because cookies freeze really well, I've learned. But to freeze them for for example, feast days that I'm not in a rush to make them that day when I want to do all those fun Catholic things that just aren't realistic to make it all happen in one day. Or for days such as taking a handful of an assortment out for specifically Fat Tuesday. So let me know what you like to do for Mardi Gras and Fat Tuesday. I know we're kind of piecing together what our plans will be on this end. But this is also the season as we plan for the party before the famine to phase into Lent. And one of the things I really love in the extraordinary form of the liturgy is that this past Sunday was a celebration of what's known as Sexagesima Sunday. And that is what marks kind of this 60 days leading up to Easter. It's known as the second Sunday before Lent and the 8th Sunday before Easter, if you ever hear those references. But why that's important is that the church is preparing us to go in and out of these liturgical seasons. And so this celebration of Sexagesima Sunday is a phasing into Lent, a recognition that Lent is coming. In fact, the Greeks and the Slavs used to phase into Lent by this past Sunday, starting to abstain from meat, because it used to be Lent was much more intense than it is today. And for many cultures within the Catholic Church, there was no meat eaten at all during Lent. And so this phasing into Lent, even if you're not completely cutting out meat, even if you are, maybe unsure as to what you're going to do just yet this Lent, this is where the church is saying, or has in the history of the church said, hey, pay attention. This liturgical season is really important. And just as Jesus Christ spent 40 days in the desert, praying and fasting before entering into public life in his public witness that he lived out, we too are called to take these 40 days out of the year, carve them aside for profound spiritual growth, development, eradicating sin from our lives. And to do that well means we need to prepare. And I'm all about saying, hey, if you're already in the midst of Lent, it's not too late to pick things back up or start to begin with, even if you start late. But there's also that opportunity of saying, let me be intentional this Lent. Let me prepare. And so here are some tips I'd like to throw your way for getting ready. You need to pray your way into Lent. And so that means prayerfully discerning what sort of sacrifices you're going to make, what things you're going to give up, what things you're going to do. It's important that we recognize that Lent is meant to make up 3 parts: prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, and that we should really be touching on all 3 of those areas, ideally each day of Lent in some small way, or maybe a big way throughout Lent. And yet at the same time, discerning the sacrifices that we're going to make is very important. I was just talking to a friend of mine recently who had really planned on making a lot of sacrifices in her life at perhaps an imprudent time, and it led her to really impact her family in a way that negatively impacted her family by these great sacrifices that she was making as an act of faith. And when we were talking about how negatively it had impacted her and impacted her interactions with other people, I really encouraged her to think about whether or not she'd actually prayerfully considered whether or not that was a sacrifice she was being called to make. And she said, no, I didn't. I'd never even thought of that. And it's a good lesson. I remember a priest friend of mine about 5 years ago said, so often we're focused on, this is what I'm doing for Lent. This is what I'm giving up for Lent. But we don't actually stop and ask, God, is this what you want from me? Is this what I'm going to do this Lent? I remember that year I had decided that I wasn't going to focus, and I don't recommend this because it's rather difficult, but I was not going to focus on a specific thing I was giving up or doing that Lent, but I was praying that each day God would kind of just reveal what that opportunity was for me to work on that day, and that was the thing I was sort of going to chase after, whether it needed to be, sin that I needed to work on eradicating from my life or a sacrifice that I could make. And it was really fascinating and a very big opportunity to grow spiritually by trying to be aware of those opportunities for sacrifices rather than always trying to go and seek them out. Because the reality is that our state in life actually already really does present its opportunity. I was even just praying late last night, looking at the crucifix on the wall in my bedroom, and I've shared with you before that our crucifix that we have, one of them, is a very special crucifix for our family because when I was married, my husband Gabriel and I exchanged our vows over the crucifix. We had our hands wrapped in the priest's stole, our hands one over the other, embracing the crucifix and the stole, and the priest holding our hands in the stole together. And when we exchanged vows, we exchanged them on the crucifix. This is an old tradition. I can share it with you a little bit more. Maybe I'll share a little bit more about it tomorrow on Trending. But one of the things that's stated by the priest when you do this is the priest actually looks at the congregation and looked at us as a couple and said that you found your cross, and that isn't one another. And I know it's a little bit of a gruesome way in some ways to look at marriage, but it's true. So often we look for all of these opportunities for sacrifice when the reality is that the opportunity to serve and sacrifice is right there in front of us. Whether it be those terrible things that all of us tend to do that negatively impact our spouse, or whether it be those things that, and bad habits, or even just quirks we don't like that our spouse engages in that we really wish they didn't do, but are an opportunity to instead set aside our feelings, our frustrations, our complaints, and embrace our spouse instead. So as we prepare for Lent, I want to encourage you to really ask the Holy Spirit to reveal to you what you are being called to this Lent. St. Teresa of Avila, in her writing in Spiritual Theology, has talked much about the need to focus on usually what presents itself as one predominant sin that we're struggling with. Often, every single one of us usually has one sin that is really just getting in the way and what's causing all of these sins. And often it's pride. And seeing how pride connects to all of those bad habits that you might have, those sins that are habitually occurring, whether venial or perhaps mortal, which if you're in a state of mortal sin, go running to confession, make the appointment, pound down Father's door, because we have certainly a very high level, an absolute level of culpability to confess our mortal sins. So a little Advent prep, or sorry, not Advent, Lent prep for you as we come up on Ash Wednesday, a week from today. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. I do want to talk for a minute about pro-life rhetoric, and what inspired this conversation is Patrick Alog, one of my producers here at Relevant Radio, went to one of the protests this past weekend at the headquarters of one of the many pharmaceutical companies that are going to be selling RU486, the abortion pill, not known as Plan B, but RU486 can really be taken up to about 10 weeks gestationally. It's so bad for women, causing autoimmune issues, hemorrhaging, death in many cases. And we aren't even reporting on our stats here in California or the United States, but the United Kingdom and other places have stats far better recognized, showing how detrimental RU486 abortion pill is for women, yet it's being deregulated and now can be sold at places such as Rite Aid and Walgreens, and they're saying they're going to start selling it. So Patrick Alog went to one of the protests yesterday addressing this specific issue at our pharmacies, and he talked to a couple of young girls about high school age, and I was interested to hear what they had to say about engaging in conversations with those who we disagree with. Listen to what they had to say about why they were there protesting and engaging in the pro-life debate today.
And what is your name?
Joanna.
And what is your name?
I'm Rose.
And then where you guys come from to go to this abortion protest here at Walgreens headquarters in Illinois?
We are from upstate New York by Syracuse.
And what inspired you guys to come all the way from Syracuse, New York, to come here to Illinois?
That Walgreens is starting to sell the abortion pill, and that I just think that women should actually know the truth about what this abortion pill does to the baby inside of them.
Now, what is it like, talking to people, fellow people your age about abortion in general?
I find that people have these buzzwords and key arguments that they hear on TikTok and everything, and they don't actually think through the issues. They don't apply critical thinking, and it's honestly frustrating to me. I'm honestly guilty of it myself sometimes. I just go on the other side, the pro-life platitudes and so forth, but I really want to understand why I support life and be able to articulate that to people, because the people on the other side, they just repeat a bunch of lines that they don't even realize what they mean or the implication of them, and they're hurting a lot of people in the process.
And what message are you guys trying to send to Walgreens and the other pharmacies?
That this abortion pill is very dangerous and risky, and I think abortion should stop around nationwide.
These two young women who traveled from New York to Illinois to oppose Walgreens, at Walgreens headquarters, actually selling RU46 abortion pill there at the pharmacy. It's shocking to know that that's even going to happen, and this will be a massive, unfortunate expansion of abortion. But one thing that really stood out in what these two high school age girls were sharing was the line where they mentioned people just keep repeating pro-abortion lines from TikTok. That's important to recognize, that they recognize, high schoolers today, that their peers are pro-abortion mainly because they're just reiterating what they're hearing from their realm of social media influencers on TikTok. So one, yes, it does say that we need to engage where young people are at on TikTok and these social media programs, but it also says, and something that they mentioned important, that other people need to hear the pro-life arguments. And yes, they need to hear them on social media, but they need to hear more than one-liners. They need to grapple with the idea. They need to be challenged. They need to be able to work through their ideas. I find that really most people are actually not pro-abortion. They just think they are pro-abortion. And when I have engaged in pro-abortion arguments, especially just going out on the streets, going to the beach, engaging in pro-life activism, heading to the mall, actually asking questions and saying, did you know this? Or what do you think about that? Often people don't actually know what they think about the intricacy of how horribly abortion impacts a woman and how it actually kills a child. And many people are left speechless, or as this young woman said, repeating the same lines over and over again that they've heard. And we have to push that narrative to get people thinking, because it really does change hearts and minds with regard to the pro-life issue and being pro-woman and pro-life, and that the two go hand in hand. Dating, marriage, relationships, so many questions. This is Timmerie from Trending with Timmerie. Thursday is our weekly marriage hour, and we'll do anything and everything from taking your questions on dating, marriage, relationships, including experts in all areas of relationships to long-term marriage. And we'll also dive into some of the most important topics confronting how to find true love today. So join me Thursday at 6 p.m. Central on Relevant Radio or the Relevant Radio app.